If you or someone you know is struggling with alcoholism or addiction, do not hesitate to reach out for help. You can find numerous free resources on our website, thebeginagainpodcast.com, and there are tons of resources and support networks available online, in person, or just a phone call away. You don't have to face this challenge alone. Welcome to the Begin Again podcast. I'm your host, Gary Menkes. On the Begin Again podcast, we delve into the inspiring journeys of individuals who have overcome alcoholism and addiction and emerged as true trailblazers in entrepreneurship, business, sports, and beyond. Through authentic, uplifting, and profound conversations with our guests, we aim to shatter the stigma surrounding addiction and demonstrate that recovery can be a catalyst for remarkable success, strength, and resilience. We firmly believe that by listening to these accounts, you will be empowered to unlock your own potential, instigate positive change in your life, and contribute to the creation of a better world. So, get ready to be inspired and embark on your own personal journey of growth with the Begin Again podcast. Welcome back to the Begin Again podcast. I'm your host, Gary Menkes, and joining us today is author, speaker, mom, social worker, and recovering alcoholic, Janice Johnson Dowd. Janice, welcome to the show. Thanks for being here.
Thanks. I'm honored to be a guest on your show. You do such a great job with your podcast, so I'm flattered to be here.
I appreciate that very much, and I love the content that you put out. I'm pretty much, yes, I'm on all platforms, but I really focus on Instagram, and I love the content that you put out on Instagram, which is parenting_in_recovery, correct?
That's correct. Thank you.
That's amazing. You know, I admire people, you know, it's a new concept for me, fairly new, recover out loud, but what an amazing, beautiful community of people it is. And people just wanting to help each other. And I think it's a really important concept because I think more people have to realize, right? Like we just talked off camera, that they're not alone and that they can completely change their lives in sobriety.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm 10 years sober now, and I would have never imagined 11 years ago that my life would look like this. I'm just very blessed.
I love it. Well, take us back. How did it look like 11 years ago?
11 years ago, I was an active alcoholic. Alcohol is my drug of choice. My bottom was much more of an emotional, spiritual bottom.
Mm-hmm.
And because I didn't have a lot of DUIs or a lot of obvious consequences to my drinking. And that's primarily because I think I was a late in life drinker. But my story in a nutshell is this.
Yeah.
I grew up in an alcoholic home. My dad was what you would call a functioning alcoholic. My parents had great intentions. They did the best they could. They made a lot of mistakes because they were both from dysfunctional families too.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, interesting part of their story is that they're both children of immigrants. So there are some cultural differences there too.
Mm-hmm.
And a really strong emphasis on, I don't know how to say this, but on paternal, how do you say, but like everything, dad ruled everything.
Right.
Because they both came from cultures like that. It was very paternal oriented. But anyhow, I grew up in this family, knew it was, it wasn't right. We definitely were the typical alcoholic family where it was confusing at home, chaotic at times, but we presented ourselves to the outside world as the all-American family, so when I was struggling with those internal mixed feelings, I, of course, assumed it was all my fault, that I must be the crazy one. And not to expand on that too much, but I emerged your classic adult child of an alcoholic.
Mm.
I was the only daughter, the youngest child. I was in this family where women were not valued as much as men. So I never believed that I was good enough or could be good enough. I was insecure, low self-esteem, afraid of authority figures, all of those things. And because we moved around a lot as a child, I learned to be really adaptive. I learned to make friends easy, but I also learned not to get too close because we were probably going to move again in a couple of years. So I really, as a kid, didn't develop my own identity, and I became what others wanted me to be. So my family, that was the cute little girl to distract from the family conflict. As a teenager, I got pushed into sports, so I became the athlete, and which was my escape from the family chaos. I did experiment with alcohol and drugs when I was young, but honestly, I didn't like the side effects. Alcohol did not relax me. It made me feel out of control. And that ACA issue of wanting to have complete control of my environment conflicted with that. Sorry, kids, my kids will hear this. I smoked a little pot. This day and age, that's not a big deal. But back then it was a big deal. And I definitely didn't like that because it made me feel paranoid. And because it was illegal, then I was like, oh God, what happens? I'll bring shame to the family if I get caught.
Right.
So I relied upon athletics as an escape. And that took me to college. And of course, I am drawn to psychology and social work, and I became a social worker. So I started off my 12-step career as an adult child of an alcoholic.
Wow.
And was very drawn to research and study in school. And so I became a pretty good social worker. And in my career, my first part of my career, I worked in drug and alcohol treatment facilities.
Wow.
I drank randomly, but occasionally. But at that point in my life, I practiced an Al-Anon program. I was getting involved with ACA in its early stages. And I think I knew that I would have the genes, so I just kind of resisted. And then I still had, sports. I did triathlons and biathlons in my 20s. So
wow.
As a young kid, I didn't become an alcoholic because of sports. As a young woman, I didn't become an alcoholic, the alcoholism didn't raise its ugly head because I was really focused on still sports, but also on my career.
Sure.
And then I met and married my now ex-husband. And my next 10 years of my life was focusing on balancing work and being a mom. I had 4 kids in 10 years, in 8 years. So most of my 30s, I didn't drink because I was pregnant, breastfeeding, having babies. So in my 40s, I started drinking, and it started just like, this mommy wine culture that's going around now.
Sure.
I heard you talk on one of your previous podcasts about, there's a lot of, there's a direction of being alcohol free, like removing alcohol from your life or limiting it. So you don't necessarily have to call yourself an alcoholic. And I support that. But for me, once I triggered those alcoholic genes, I became a full-blown alcoholic. I did try to moderate it for a long time, which is what led to my spiritual breakdown.
Yeah.
Because sometime in my 40s, I went from social drinking to alcoholism. I think a big part of it was the death of my dad, which I think, a lot of us have some kind of trigger moment that pushes us into really destructive behavior.
Sure.
But along the way, as I was drinking more and more, I was in great denial. I decided I needed to fix myself, and I tried every other thing to do before I removed the alcohol. I knew about AA. I hadn't been working a program in, a few years because I was a busy mom. So I went back to therapy. I tried anti-anxiety medication, sleeping medication. And I fooled myself for a little while because I was able to decrease my drinking, but my behavior was still as crazy. So, and I have a pretty strong opinion about cross addiction. So for me, now that I'm on the other sober side, I'm on the other side and I'm sober, even though marijuana, there's California sober, a lot of concepts like that. Yeah, I try to avoid anything that's mood altering that is not prescribed. I have broken my leg and I had to go on pain medication for that for a short period of time. But, there's instances when you have to fall back and use pain medication. But for me, I am no mood altering substances, if all possible. So that's my drinking history. The people who suffered the most for my drinking were my immediate family, because most of my drinking was done at home late at night. I was in denial about how much I was affecting my kids and my family, because I thought, well, I'm not getting DUIs. I moderated my drinking a little bit. But I was so terribly wrong. And finally, push came to shove. And my best friend and a couple of family members did an intervention on me, and I went to treatment.
Wow.
Yeah, with
That's
my head hung down, because here I had worked in treatment facilities, and I was so ashamed of, I should have known better. I grew up in this family. As a kid, I swore I'd never
Yeah.
never become an alcoholic or put my kids through
right.
what I'd been through. And here I was.
Right.
Now, I don't know if do you have experience like that as well, or no?
I have a lot of experience like that. Actually, what you had just said, I had seen my dad do a lot of things when I was really young, drug wise, and like cocaine was one of them. And growing up, like high school, like I hated cocaine and I was just never, ever going to do that. I was alcoholic from the get go. I got in trouble really early, 16, like big time trouble. I was alcoholic from the get go, like I said, but I hated cocaine because I was never going to be like that guy.
Mhm.
And I graduated at some point to some place and I found cocaine and I was, it allowed me to drink more. But I did cocaine alcoholically, like pedal to the metal, like nothing was ever enough. Kind of funny, I guess, funny in our community, we get to laugh at this stuff because we relate to each other, relate
Right.
so much to it. But, I still hated, even like after, being active in it, I still like hated it. And I would like start the night, like, I'm going out tonight, but I'll let those guys do whatever they're going to do. But as soon as I had a few drinks in me, I was like, call the guy, get it over here, get it here now. And like, it came to the point where, I had some really good buddies. We all like to have a good time, don't get me wrong, but they did it a lot more responsibly. And to the point where like they had to hide it from me. And, I was almost like threatening my best friends, like call them right now, get them. I mean, that's kind of how I rolled and that's how it was. And I would do it all. And then we'd have to call them again. It was chaos. So I totally relate to what you're saying is, you're seeing your parents and growing up, probably telling yourself like, whatever happens, I'm never going to do that. Right. And, you immerse yourself too. I think there's something there as well that's the field you went into. Obviously it dominated your mind at a young age, maybe without even knowing it, like even subconsciously, because that's the path you chose and that's the career path you chose. You were helping people and here you are getting blindsided by an intervention where maybe you do know somewhere deep inside. I think I knew certainly late, towards the end, I was never going to go back to AA. AA is what saved my life. Speaking just quick about California sobriety, like I do not subscribe to that, like even a little bit. I know there's people that, whatever works for you, it's fine. I am not, however you get here, you get here. I don't care at all. Me, if someone asks me how I got sober, it's an Alcoholics Anonymous and saved my life. And I was, you said a classic alcoholic. I was a raging alcoholic from a young age, and I kind of got the stories and the troubles to back that up. I totally relate to that, but that's part of the disease too. Like that's part of the alcoholism, at least for this guy. Like I hated that my whole life, and I found it, and it was off to the races. I do think it helped speed up all of my bottoms. I had multiple bottoms, but I
Mhm.
really do think it helped speed it up. Because once I did find like cocaine, I've done plenty of other stuff, but the cocaine like allowed me to drink more. I love to drink. I was alcoholic from the get-go, and that's my drug of choice, if you will. And that's what took me down, and that's what I loved. I had a love affair with drinking early on, and you know, crazy, absurd, really sick visions of grandeur as a young man of me, having this family and this bar in my house and like being drunk and drinking scotch. And like, I'm talking like as a teenager, like just, it's absurd. And it's kind of bothers me to even, I haven't said that in a while, but it's true. But, that's part of my path and part of my journey. And, you know, part of my career into where it took me. So no, Janice, I completely relate to that. But so here you are, you have 4 kids, and they all come, and I'm guessing your whole family, and off you go, and now you're the subject matter, right?
That's true. That's true. My kids were ages 13, 15, 19, and 21 when I went to treatment. Wow. So 2 of them were in college.
Mm.
And now I have to, well, yeah, I won't go down that road. 2 of them were at college. The oldest one probably had been the least impacted by my drinking because it didn't get bad until the last couple of years of his in high school. You know, it didn't get obvious. Let's put it that way. I was able to hide it. But the other 3 were greatly impacted. And I have 3 boys and a daughter. My daughter's the second child. And as I left the home for treatment, she became the second mother, which became, you know, an interesting aspect of recovery for us because I had to gradually take over my role back. But I went to treatment full of shame, but thinking that I knew what to expect. I thought I'll be here for 4 weeks. We'll do a family program.
Nobody knows it better than you. Right?
I thought that goes to my arrogance. But and then we'll get involved in family therapy and we'll be well on our way to recovery. But when I got there, after you hit that first resistance, and I realized just how much damage I'd done, and I started to open up and share about some of the deeper wounds from my childhood, a couple of traumatic experiences, and I started to talk about the grief, the issues I had with grief, with the loss of my dad, a lot of guilt over that. And they came to me and said, we think you should stay longer. So to make a long story short, my 4-week inpatient stay extended to 12 and was then followed up with 3 months at a women's halfway house and then another year at sober living. And then the problem with all of this is that it was 200 miles away from my family. And so early on in those first few weeks, it was very difficult for them to come and be involved in the family program or family therapy or marital therapy because of the distance. Sure. And because my ex-husband was having to be both mom and dad, and all of the 2 younger kids who are still at home full time were very active in sports and extracurricular activities. And so it was hard for them to come see me. Yeah. And then on the other side of that, this is where the mistakes I made in repairing relationships with my family started. So the other side of that is, and I'm sure you're aware of this, you remove the alcohol and drugs, which are your main coping mechanism, you become a raw bundle of nerves. Right?
Oh, of course, absolutely.
And all of those feelings and stuff that you've stuffed down forever come out, and you need a lot of support. I needed a lot of support. Yeah. And I started to feel really comfortable in treatment. I was comfortable with the idea of going to a halfway house, which might seem odd, but because my family wasn't able to come up and be with me, so I wasn't relying upon them so much for extended support. I was building a family within the treatment community. So that it felt safe. It felt like my triggers would be much easier to be managed if I was at a halfway house. And I also, being a good little obedient ACA, I followed directions well. And so when they said, we think you should go to a halfway house, I was like, yes, which one? I didn't debate it. I didn't question it. I just went along. And on the other side of that, my fears of abandonment and rejection that stem from my childhood, I placed upon my family, my kids, and my husband. And I avoided discussing with them what I was doing because I was afraid I'd have to, oh God, we can get really analytical here, but I was afraid that they wouldn't understand, wouldn't get it, reject it, and then I'd have to choose. So I just never gave them a choice. I never gave them involvement in that decision. And that was a huge mistake in my relationships with my kids because it looked to them like I was just abandoning them.
Sure.
That I was leaving them like I had before. And this behavior on my part, because I was getting more and more involved in the recovery program. So my language became much more 12-step, one day at a time, first things first. And
Mm,
I got to clean up my house before I can help, clean up the outside of my house. All of that to them was just confusing.
right.
And recently I asked my daughter about what was the best thing that I did to help our relationship improve and what was the worst thing. And one of the things she said about the best thing was consistency, that I stayed sober. I got and stayed sober.
Mm,
The worst thing was that I used the program jargon to help explain, but not explain, just to justify
right.
my behaviors.
Sure.
So again, what happened was I created this big divide between myself and my family. And I honestly didn't see it until I was at 6 months sober. And I didn't realize how much pain I was inflicting upon, especially my children, in those early months of sobriety. That I was, again, going back to abandoning them, putting a wall between us, not being there for them. I essentially was doing the same old behavior that I had in active addiction, just with a different flavor on it. And I was probably 6 months sober when I got kicked out of my halfway house for something I didn't do. But it turned out to be one of the best things ever for me,
Mm,
because the woman there in my AA support group had become my second family. So in getting kicked out of the house, I lost that family too.
right.
I slipped into a really deep, dark depression during that time period because I found that I had no real identity. So if I take
Mm,
you back to growing up, I was the child, the athlete, the social worker, and then I was the mother. And the mother was the identity that I really embraced. When I got sober, I transferred those mother things because I'm in my 60s now. So I was at the halfway house. I was one of the older women there. And
mm.
all of those girls there who were in their 20s, 30s, I became my children. So I maintained my mom identity in the halfway house. And then it was yanked from me.
And so when you get kicked out, I mean, you just
Mhm.
said so much there. You really did. You're talking about it's a topic that comes up every single episode is childhood trauma, right? And you mentioned triggers. When you said triggers first, I was waiting to see where the childhood trauma was, and obviously you've got plenty of that. You can't help but think of this sort of really difficult conundrum for you though as well. Like we had just talked how we can relate, like we're not going to be like our parents, like we're not going to
Mhm.
be like them. And here you are in a place to heal and to get better in rehab and doing all you have to do. And it's the first time maybe that we start working on ourselves for
Mhm.
sure. But at the same time, and he said, without even realizing it, you're doing abandonment issues, things that you had felt growing up in your own household, your own life, right? Or of feeling abandoned, and you're doing it in recovery, which
Mhm.
is, I'm hearing it. I'm like, oh, it's so difficult. And complete on, I can see your children as well. Obviously, I know you can see that as well. You can see where they're coming from as well. I know we talked about your daughter briefly before off camera, and there was a chance she was going to join us. So maybe we'll do that again next time. I hope she's feeling better. But so you get kicked out of the halfway house 6 months in. Do you go home? Is you coming home now?
I couldn't go home. I couldn't go home because I got kicked out on a Sunday. On a Friday, I'd had a disastrous family counseling session with my
Mm,
therapist in Birmingham. And there was always that threat that your children are going to get permanently taken from you. So
wow.
I felt the need to keep this a secret from my friends and family at home.
Sure.
Thankfully, I was working a good program, so I didn't start drinking. And as a side note, this is why with my sponsees, I always, always say, you've got to have a good foundation of recovery because life is going to happen.
Yep.
And this happened to me. It was devastating, but I stayed sober. And I'm proud of myself for that. And it's really because I worked that program. and because I
Yeah.
had a mean as hell sponsor. So mean, but compassionate.
Yeah.
And so she let me come and stay with her for a week. And she's like, just 1 week. You got a week to figure your stuff out.
Yeah.
And I applied to like every other halfway house in town and got rejected from most of them, which was,
Is it because
again, I was
you got
like,
rejected because of the kick out, or?
well, different reasons for different places. So,
All right. So you're,
yeah.
you're trying to get into another one.
I'm trying to get into another one. And then I eventually found a place to go.
Gotcha.
And thank God for that. And I stayed there and I kept it a secret a while from my family. I let them think I was still at the halfway house because I was afraid. And during that time, it occurred to me I was been working with a therapist. I had not been doing group therapy and I hadn't been working really strongly on those childhood issues because I felt like I needed a break from them
Mm.
when I got out of treatment. I needed to just learn how to be sober in the real world. So anyhow, I finally went back and did that. I did that work. I worked again on the ACA issues. My therapist helped me identify how those family of origin issues were impacting my parenting at that time. Does that make sense? Like I hadn't
Absolutely.
seen
Of
that
course.
before,
Yeah.
which is a really important point that, this is why we need others. We need our 12-step friends, peers, sponsors, our therapists, if you're like me and have bigger issues, because it's really hard to diagnose yourself, to look at your situation objectively.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, that's where I finally, at 6 months sober, well, it was probably more like 8 months because I was really depressed for 2 months.
Mm.
I actively put on my social work hat, did some research, talked to people, looked back at the fundamental skills, what's going to help, what's not going to help. But more importantly, I reached out to the old timers in my meetings. I reached out to, so the 12-week program that I went to, I still maintained relationships with a lot of those women. And I reached out to some of them and talked with their kids. So I'll never forget Kim Davis. Was one of my closest friends in treatment, and she had 2 sons that were close in age to 2 of my boys. And I sat down and talked with them and learned what I could from them.
That's amazing. So these, like Kim Davis is one of those sort of children from the first initial 12 weeks, right? Is this where you're one of the motherly, you taking the motherly role with?
Well, no. Kim actually was my peer in the inpatient
Okay.
treatment. One of my closest friends
What
there.
made you, or how did that come about where, Kim wanted you to speak to her children?
No, I asked Kim. I was like,
You wanted
because I
to,
was still connecting with my people, all my friends from treatment.
right?
And I'm pretty sure I was like, because Kim lived about an hour north of Birmingham. And I was like, you've got boys my kid's age. I mean, that's kind of how we bonded in treatment. I remember the very first thing that I remember about her when we were in detox together was she pulled out these pictures and was like, here are my sons. What kind of kids do you have? We identified with each other because we were
Right.
both
You
moms.
clicked, you're right.
Yeah. So I reached out to her boys. And then also I talked to other people in the program, anyone who was young in the meetings, the 12-step groups. I'd pull them aside and go, hey, I'm having a hard time with my kids. And
So I was going to ask you, the motivation to speak to those boys was to educate yourself and to learn about
absolutely
what's going to happen when I get back home type of thing.
right.
Wow.
And
That's
what
really,
has your mom done that worked and what did not work?
what, that's incredible that you went there. Do you think, where do you attribute that to? Is that to your background in your career background? Is that, because I think that you don't hear that. You do not hear that. You're in a bad spot. You have, you're in a rehab. You're trying to get well. I need to educate myself on how to speak to my children and what works and what doesn't work. I mean, I haven't heard that before. What do you think you attribute that? What was inside you? I think that's so profound that was where you went.
Well, thank you for saying that. I think it's because everything else I was doing was not working. The textbook stuff, reading about it. And in fact, I couldn't find a whole lot of information, which is why I eventually wrote the book. I couldn't find information on how to help parents repair relationships with their kids, or how to help anyone new in recovery to really repair their relationships. So it really was like trial and error and reaching out to people. And, again, I grew up unhappy as a teenager. And at that point in my life, I had wished someone had come to me and go, "What's wrong? Let's talk." But I was too afraid to ask for help. So I think I had learned enough from the program that asking for help is a sign of strength,
Absolutely. That's an
and
important message. I think we should say that again. Asking
yes.
for help is an absolute sign of strength and is not a sign of cowardice, even though it's been drilled into us, especially our age group. I think the older we are, like, you don't
Mhm.
say, you don't ask anybody for anything, right? You don't tell anybody your feelings, but you're couldn't be any more correct, in my opinion. Reaching out for help is an absolute important thing, and it's a real sign of strength.
It is. It is. And it's so important. And so that essentially what I was doing. I was talking to everyone. I was also looking for hope, which is why, again, another reason why I wrote the book is because I want people to know that no matter how bad the relationship is, if you're committed to amending it, you can make forward progress. It might take a long time, it might take some trial and error. What worked for me may not work for you, but let's try as many things as possible. So, I mean, that's what I did at that point. And I still made a lot of crazy mistakes, which I talk about in the book. Some of the typical myths and mistakes you make, like shoving down the program, talking about it too much.
Right.
Here's another, for instance. I
Sure.
remember, so I started coming home for visits more often with my family, and I was very proud of my NA key tags hanging on the outside of my purse.
Yeah. Yeah.
I had that pink cloud thing for a while where I really wanted to explain to everyone, like, oh, I was an alcoholic. That's why I was acting so inconsistently before I, mysteriously left.
Right.
But that embarrassed my kids.
Sure.
And my kids and my family were keeping the secret that mom's an alcoholic.
Right.
And so where was I going with this? Well, the point being is that I had to honor their feelings.
Right.
I had to accept they're not as completely comfortable with my sobriety or my testimony about my sobriety,
Sure.
which is I think an important point that I make in the book is that you've got to honor your kids' feelings. You've got to honor where they are. One of the things that I experienced early in treatment was, okay, so to be honest, I was abusive towards my kids. Not physically abusive, but definitely emotionally mean when I was drinking late at night. I wasn't aware of all of it because some of it was in blackouts, but I was abusive towards my kids. Go to treatment and you hear people who are abusive to their kids, and it has involved physical violence,
Right.
or they have had their kids removed. I can say this now because I'm removed from it, but my first impulse was to be like, oh, see, I'm not as bad.
Right. We compare.
I never abused my kids.
Right. I'm not that bad.
No, I'm not that bad. But the truth is, it was bad. It just as bad because I damaged my kids. And so this is a mistake a lot of parents or wives or husbands make with or children when they're trying to repair the relationships with their parents, is that we fail to recognize the level of pain the other person feels. We think because it's not the worst thing we did, that it shouldn't hurt them that bad. So it's really important to acknowledge, to listen to, and then empathize your daughter, son, husband, wife's, their feelings. They need to be acknowledged. And I think that's a mistake that we make.
Yeah. I can speak a little bit to that. I believe, not certainly in the past, right? Like you have this comparing thing, right? Or, I'm not that bad, or, I'm not like that person. But this whole thing of, my feelings versus their feelings, for a while, I think I would treat people like, well, they have, they don't have it as bad as I had it. So they can't even kind of talk to me. They can't even they're not even my plane, when the truth is all of it, all of those feelings we're talking about are completely relative to that person. So it's not like a keeping score, right? It's not like, well, this happened to Gary and only that happened to that person. Like, whatever that in my mind is, a lower on the moral or, traumatic totem pole, if you will, it doesn't matter because it can be way more impactful to that person. And so I think that's in a nutshell a big part of sort of compassion and an open mind. Like doesn't, first of all, don't compare. Comparing in so many different avenues. Speaking for myself, like in so many different avenues of life will get you absolutely nowhere. Right. Like you can't compare traumas, you can compare materials, all of it will get you absolutely nowhere. Right. But on the same token is to, again, speaking for myself, that to have that compassion of doesn't matter. And I did this early in sobriety, like both sides of the spectrum, which I'm talking about. I'd sit in and I'd hear someone talk about, tell their story and be like, all right, well, I'm not as bad as that guy, so maybe I don't belong here, that's me itching to get out. Right.
Mhm.
But on the same token, on the flip side of that is it's all relative to that person. We all need to be compassionate, and you lived it and it's your family. So it's multiplied by thousand, if you will. Right. So,
Mhm.
and I can't help but, listen to your story and listen to you speak and your upbringing. And we touched upon it a little earlier, this whole thing of, I'm not going to be like that. And
Mhm.
the career path you choose. And then you sort of in a way have like the most grandest experiment of it all with you and your family. Not surprised, but just so admire that it's like your life's work now. And your handle on Instagram, parenting underscore in underscoring recovery. Your mission, you can tell even as you're talking, is to help these people. And the fact that you went and did the research, which again, it's amazing to me. I think it takes so much guts to go speak to someone's children to say how, on multiple levels, right? Like I'm just picturing putting myself in those shoes. Like I'd be terrified to speak to somebody else's children on multiple levels, right? I wouldn't want them to know me. I wouldn't want, and I'd be terrified of what they're going to say, right? Because then you have to take it back, but you did it, you did it. And obviously it's not easy. And there's mountains and mountains of adversity that you've had to deal with on the way back. But before
Mhm.
we get there, and there's so much I want to ask you about as far as, tips and things, if you will,
Mhm.
how it was when you started, ingraining yourself, back in your family and when did it start turning for the better?
Great question. Um, it it was soul crunching at
Mm,
first because they were rejecting me,
mm,
you know? And that again is thankful for my sponsor and for my friends in the program who are like, just keep pushing forward, just keep pushing forward. So that didn't work, because my kids are 4 different ages,
yeah.
different life experience. The two older children, for the first 8 to 10 years of their life, I didn't drink.
Mm,
So they had a different experience than the younger two had, which I had essentially drank their whole life.
right.
Um, so it was soul crunching at first. Yeah, I mean, but you just have to be plugging away.
Yeah.
And now there are some things that worked for one child that didn't work for another. And what I really wanted to do to instill hope is instill hope to your listeners because it takes time.
Yeah.
I would say it was a year and a half. I was about a year and a half sober, or a year into actively working to repair those relationships before I saw any progress with any of my kids. Otherwise,
Mm,
I mean, we talked to each other, but it was so superficial and they didn't trust me. They didn't believe me at times. I let them track my phone so they could, that's one of the little things I did. But I had to institute things like that to help build back the trust. So it took a year and a half sober before I could see any real significance. And then and then the others kind of fell in line. Again, with the oldest child, I don't know if that relationship was as damaged as the others.
mhm,
I could be totally wrong. He could hear this and go, "Oh no."
yeah.
But the youngest child, it took me 4 years before I could see a difference. And it kind of makes sense because he was 13 when I got sober. He was very aligned with his father. It makes sense that it took the longest time with him. And I just learned to be patient with it. And I've shared this story. It actually was published in the Grapevine. and about how, like, the turning point where I could see something different with him was like, it was Super Bowl weekend was coming up in his senior year of high school. And he asked me, and I used to be the fun mom when my kids were little. I would have the parties, the big blow up things. I'd load 8 kids into my Suburban, take them all to the beach. I mean, I was the fun mom before I started drinking.
That's great.
So, but later in life, the kids stop bringing friends home
Mhm.
because they don't know how you're going to react. They don't
Right.
invite their friends over. They don't ask you to carpool because God, you might be drinking.
Mhm.
But on this particular, it was coming up to Super Bowl Sunday, and my son asked if he could have friends over to watch the game. And I was like, I mean, it may not seem like a big deal to you and your listeners, but it was huge. It was huge. I was thrilled to tears that he wanted to have his friends back to the house.
That's amazing. And it does mean a lot. I totally get it. And I see you filling up so much and want to give you a hug as you're telling this
Mhm.
story. You know, it seems like such a small little thing that he reached out to you and said, "Hey, can I have friends in my house?" And that's a big deal, right? Because
Yeah.
doesn't sound like there was kids coming over your house for years, right? Now that door just got slightly open just a little bit. And
Mhm.
I say it a lot too, Janice. Of all the stuff, it's a collection of all the super small stuff that we've gotten back, that I've gotten back,
Mhm.
that make the biggest difference. I say this often and it sounds silly, but it's so important and impactful to me. Like every time the phone rings now, like I have an instant sense of gratitude that I can answer that phone, because for so long, every time the phone rang, there was an instant sense of anxiety and fear of who's calling me, who's chasing me down, what did I do? And to this day, I've been sober, God willing, May I'll be sober 18 years. Like when the phone rings, I have a really quick, it sounds silly, but it's super small, but it means a lot. I have an instant sense of gratitude that, like, I don't live that way how I used to. I can actually answer this phone right now. And so I totally get, but yours is so much bigger. It sounds small, but it's so much bigger, right? To have your boy, open that door again for you.
Mhm.
And I can't help but think about, making living amends, right? We talk
Mhm.
about that a lot in the program. Some of the things we can't go back on, but the best way that we can move forward, and it's all, your entire story is about moving forward. You
It is.
can't, I say this a lot, like I don't forget where I came from, and that means where I was, 18 years ago, but don't live there, because that's not going to do me or anyone else any good. If I sit and live there, then everyone else is going to be affected. I'm not going to get any better. I'm not going to grow. I'm not going to move forward. But so it's okay for me. This is how I got to remember where I came from, but it's always moving forward. It's always putting the best foot forward and going forward, and leading with love is another one we've been saying a lot lately, which is, I wasn't talking that way 18 years ago, and if you told myself 18 years ago this is the way I would talk, yeah, I'd probably say, what happened to me? And you're crazy. It's such a more beautiful way to live life today. But so here you are, you're making these living amends. It takes so long for your youngest, but the doors start cracking open. And now I know you're working on your book, but
Mhm.
your life's journey, your life's mission, clearly, and everything that you put out is helping parents in recovery. Tell us about that.
It is. Yeah, and relationships in recovery too. I mean, my marriage did not survive, but it doesn't mean that marriages don't survive. Like I've heard you say, I think when you got sober, your wife was your girlfriend, correct?
It's funny you say that. I think I've been able to, without trying, to say that my girlfriend at the time, who is now my wife, and I
Mhm.
love saying that. And I think, I don't know how many episodes we've done, but I think I've had a chance to say that every time. But yes, you have listened in. I have said that. Yes.
Yes. See, and I just think that's wonderful. I think, if you can keep a marriage together, that's a blessing. If you can't, then you have to have a working, co-parenting, which is also, it takes working the steps of the program to do well for the sake of your kids.
Absolutely.
So yeah, so I really like to impress upon people that relationships can be repaired. Um, improved. There are maybe some relationships, and I have a portion in the book about grieving those relationships that can't be repaired because they're abused. I've heard from a number of people who said, well, I'm not going to repair the relationship with my parent because they're still in active addiction, or they're still in denial, or they're still abusive to me. Well, by all means, cut that off until they get it.
Right.
That's improving on your side, improving your comfort level
Sure.
with that state. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. I think there's an element of also there as far, making sure, which is what we do in recovery, right? Actively making sure our side of the street is clean, making sure our side of the street is clean. Like you said earlier, right? Sometimes it takes a long time, right? But no, of course, don't, if that doesn't, especially early on, do not, seek to dive, my opinion, do not seek to dive back into those relationships that maybe, aren't working for you, especially you just talked about, maybe a newly sober person is, wants to, reach, fix a relationship with someone that's still very active in that. I think that's a very difficult place to be. You got to take care of yourself early on, in my opinion. You really do. I can't help, but I have to touch upon too, but we're talking about relationships, and my girlfriend, my wife, she's seen it all. Like, she's seen the good, the bad, and she's seen all the ugly. And, her whole family, who I love, to death now, but her whole family at the time was, on her, telling her, why, what are you doing with this guy? I mean, he keeps taking off. He's a maniac. He's not good for you. He's not good for, and they were all right. It was all things that I earned, 10 times over. And, not only was she able to somehow stay with me, and we have a beautiful relationship, and now we have 2 children, 10 and 9, but, my relationship with all my in-laws is, like, I love every single one of them, and they all mean so much to me. And they've been so supportive of this podcast, which I didn't even want them to know about it at first. I wanted it to be like a good 6 months in and maybe doing something, but they've been on board, my nieces, since the first episode. And, my point is, and I think it's what we touched upon off camera about, inspiring people. Like, you never know. Like, you can, my relationship with all of them is, I think it's safe to say, probably, better than it could possibly be. But they're all so important to me. Every single one of them. And, it wasn't like that 18 years ago, and again, I say that because some of them may be listening, like, I've earned it 10 times over, but just like you had said, it took you a long time, 4 years with the youngest. I don't know how long it took. I just take care of yourself, keep putting the best foot forward, keep doing the right thing. Go easy on yourself too. I think we're in a community of people, if you will, that's so quick and so easy to beat ourselves up, especially early on, or maybe always. I don't know. So, all those signs in the meetings, Janice, easy does it, first things first, none of them made sense. And all of a sudden I started seeing clearer, and they all made sense. KISS, keep it simple, stupid. I use that in so many areas of my life. It's a simple program for complicated people, and I can make everything complicated in a real hurry, so KISS, keep it simple, stupid, is one I use very often, like I said, in all aspects of our life. So tell us about I think it's amazing. And, you're being published too. Like, this is a little more in depth than some of the other authors out there, in complete fairness, right? So there's a huge process to your book, but tell us about the book.
Okay. So in a nutshell, I wrote the book that I wish had been available for me when I first got sober. I combined my professional experience, because I've still been a part-time social worker, recently retired, so I could focus on the book and the podcast.
Yeah.
But it's the book I wish had been there for me. It's written, although it's got my professional training, it's written in very simple terms. You know what I mean? Because when we're early, I don't know if you experienced this, but I know the first 2 years of my recovery, there still was some brain fog there. I mean, look back at it now, some decisions I made were ridiculous, and I can laugh about them now. But I remember at the time thinking, I am so right. This is the right decision. But there was that brain fog. So the book is written very simply, easy to read, easy to understand. I tell a little bit of my story. I give a very, very simplified version of the broken brain, because I
Mm,
think that's important to understand how we're so prone to relapse
mm,
in early recovery just because of the science of addiction, which hopefully, it continues to evolve that information. Um, and I give tips and tools and myths and different things to help you along the way. I address, my favorite chapter is actually how to make a good and amends.
ah,
My
very good.
sponsor was a retired school teacher. So in fact, she's instrumental in the book because she would hand me all these handouts to do. Like my fourth step was like 8 pages long, just the directions,
Wow.
So I had a lot of good information to fall back on. But
Yeah.
anyhow, it's kind of a easy to read, guided self-guide for repairing relationships. It is something that I think that you would want to reflect back on. And I mentioned that in the first chapter, like it's not a one and done read. It's one, come back, because some of the stuff you might not absorb. It's a fun read. It is written in the 12-step voice,
Great.
because that's what I know, but anyone can take advantage of it.
Sure.
And I acknowledge there's different higher powers and there's different ways to get sober, to get clean or sober. Doesn't have to be necessarily with AA. So the book would lend itself to any relationships that need repair. And also it's, for a while there, I was addressing the book also to those recovering from some mental illnesses,
Mhm.
because ADHD, OCD, bipolar 2,
Mhm.
some of us, or some of those people with these diagnoses, have done a lot of damage to their relationships too. And once you're in recovery, I think the principles and the tools in the book would apply to that as well. Um, so it's in general a good relationship book. Does that answer your
Excellent.
question?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's wonderful again, and I think it maybe a couple of times I touched upon this, but just hearing your story and what you've been through, and here you are writing a book really for you and for the future use that can use all your help and tips, because your story is incredible. It is super inspiring. I know we said off camera, right? We want to help one person, but we're getting a little more ambitious. Maybe we can help a few more than one person. I know you're going to help people, a lot of people with this podcast. Where can we find you, Janice? Where can I know you're on Instagram, but let's hear it from you. Where can we find you?
Okay, so I also have a website. It's new. I need to expand it a little bit, but it's www.janicejohnsondowd.com. And I'm trying to attach my podcast to it now. Technology is my weakness, I have to say. And I am at the mercy of my daughter-in-law and my daughter with and actually my middle son too. They've all been very helpful with technology. So, but they're all busy people too. So we
Course.
kind of do that work together.
You're not alone there either, by the way.
It's so frustrating at times,
No,
but it's okay. It's my age and my generation.
no.
So,
So that's
but
your
anyhow,
website.
yeah, and
And what about your
my
socials?
my well, I'm on Facebook and I have but that Facebook is really, and it's under Janice Johnson Dowd. It's really more family oriented. I don't put a whole lot of stuff on it. Instagram is my main
That's your place. And
social media. And if it weren't for my daughter-in-law, I wouldn't be on that. And my agent saying you have to have a social media presence. So
well, the content you put out on Instagram, that's where I am mostly, is fantastic. And we interact a lot there. And
mhm.
please go give her a follow parenting _ recovery. Find her website. We're going to put this all on all the show notes as well. But Janice, is there anything else you want to leave with us? You've given us so much wisdom today. Is there one last little bit of wisdom you want to leave with us?
Okay, so the most important thing in repairing relationships is to maintain your sobriety and to be honest if you have any slips or relapses. The second most important thing is to find balance between your sobriety, your recovery. So your social, spiritual, physical, and there's a fourth one. But anyhow, all aspects of your mental health to find balance. But I really want to give people hope that, I mean, my relationships with my kids now are outstanding. I have traveled with most of them. My daughter and I tried out for the Amazing Race together. Yeah.
That's so fun.
So, I'm living a simple life. I'm a budget traveler, but, I'm experiencing so many great things, and it's all because of my sobriety.
I'm so glad we closed with that, because that's the most important message of all. Look at the relationship you have with your children today, and it's all because of your sobriety. Janice, thank you so much for coming on. It's been such a pleasure. We'll have to do this again when the book is about to get released, and we're gonna blast that all out. And I can't thank you enough for your all that you do, for your service, and for your life's work. It's really beautiful. And let's recover out loud together. Thanks for being here, Janice.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for tuning in to another powerful episode of the Begin Again podcast. We sincerely appreciate your time and support. We hope that today's conversation has ignited a spark within you, affirming that recovery is not only attainable, but can also be a wellspring of strength and resilience. Our ultimate goal is to make a difference in someone's life every single day. By sharing these stories of redemption, we strive to empower you and inspire you to unlock your fullest potential, facilitate positive transformations, and contribute to creating a better future for yourself, for your loved ones, and the world at large. If you know someone who could benefit from listening to our show, please share it with them. And if you resonate with our mission and feel compelled to do so, we would greatly appreciate your support through a 5-star review, following us on Instagram, and subscribing to our YouTube channel, The Begin Again Podcast. The more positive reviews we receive and the wider our message spreads, the greater our collective ability to help others realize that change is possible in their own lives. Thank you once again for being a part of our community. May you be blessed on your own journey of personal growth and transformation.